Hi, I'm Cullen Kelly. I'm a master trainer for Blackmagic Design, and I'm here to talk to you today about color management inside of DaVinci Resolve 17. Now, before we dive into the way we can use color management in Resolve, we need to understand what color management is. So to do that, let's take a look at this clip that I've got here in front of me in my project. Now, as you can see, I currently am looking at this image in a sort of flat log state. So the contrast is very low, don't have much saturation, and I generally need to get it into a more vibrant place before I can really begin to do anything else. One way that I might approach that task would be to go down here into my primary section and begin to manipulate my contrast and my pivot, maybe my saturation or my lift and my gamma and my gain, and really just dial things in by eye until I'm starting to get an acceptable visual result. This would be what's known as a display-referred approach to color grading, meaning that we are literally using our display as our reference for all of our visual decisions. This is a common way of working, and it stands at odds with color management, which is about using image science and math to transform what the camera saw into what our display can reproduce in a systematic way. It's more efficient than doing things by hand in this display-referred method, and it allows us to do a couple of things. It's going to allow us to match our cameras better if we have camera A or B or C, and it's also going to allow us to preserve our creative intent when we are delivering for multiple displays. I'm going to reset my grade here for now, and I want to dive into how we can tackle this grade using a color management approach. So now that we understand the purpose and the function of color management, let's talk about how we can actually employ it inside of DaVinci Resolve. There's a couple of different color management frameworks or solutions available to us in Resolve, and these include ACES, or the Academy Color Encoding System, as well as Resolve Color Management V2. Now, these are both equally sound and equally useful color management solutions, but they have slightly different interfaces and parameters that they expose to us as the user. So we're going to talk about both of them. We're also going to touch on Dolby Vision, which, while it is not a color management solution in and of itself, it is part of an ecosystem of color management in which we are mastering for HDR as well as SDR displays. Let's talk about ACES first. What I want to do is reset my grade back to its original state here, and I'm going to go to my File menu, and then I'm going to go to my Project Settings here, and I'm going to go to my Color Management section. And I want to start by talking about this very first drop-down menu that I have up here at the top called Color Science. Right now, that's set to DaVinci YRGB. And all this means is that I'm telling Resolve currently, I've got this. I'm going to take care of everything in terms of what needs to happen to get this image from the way it was shot out to its display state. This would be a good selection to make if we were working display referred, as we did a moment ago. But since we want to try out some color management workflows, we're going to explore the options available within here and select something different. In our case, we want to start with ACES CCT because this is one of the two working color spaces for the ACES color management framework. So I'm going to select this, and when I do, you'll see several new options appear down below that Color Science drop-down menu. First, we have our ACES version, which we can safely leave at its default. And the next two menu items are really the most important. This is where we are going to be telling Resolve what our original camera color space was, as well as the display that we are targeting or that we are using to master our images. So right now I have my input device transform set up to Alexa because that's what I have here on shot number 1 is an ARRI wide color gamut log C image. So I want to tell Resolve this is the original state or color space of this image as I'm feeding it into you. And then next, we're going to designate our output device transform. There are a number of different options here, but since I'm doing a traditional Rec. 709 SDR master, I want to select Rec. 709. And with these parameters selected, I want to go down to my Save button here, and let's look at what happens to our image when I do. You can see that the exact task that I was setting myself to a moment ago of trying to normalize my image and get some healthy contrast and color out of it has now been done automatically on my behalf by the ACES color management system. And you can imagine that if you had a timeline of say 20 or 200 or 2000 of these shots, how much more efficient it would be to simply designate an input color space and an output color space, and then let your color management framework do the mapping for you, as opposed to having to manually dial in the proper contrast and saturation as a baseline on every single image in your timeline. So that is the basic functionality of setting up your color management inside of an ACES color management workflow. Now, I want to point out something about these other shots here in my timeline, which happen to be raw shots. These in particular are from a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. Something that's important to know about ACES or Resolve Color Management is that when you are loading in a raw format into your project, your color management solution is actually going to pick up on the fact that that media is raw, and it is automatically going to input map it appropriately into your color management pipeline. So I just want to point out to you guys, let's go back here to shot number 1 and go back to our project settings and observe that if I change my input device transform, let's do something drastic. Let's say like Rec 709. If I change this setting and I hit save and I look at my image will change because I am instructing the color management workflow to perform the mapping using different assumptions. Let's go back and set this to Alexa as we had it before. And now let's go through that same exercise on one of these raw shots. I'm going to once again go to my File menu, Project Settings, and let's once again go from Alexa to Rec 709 and see if we get that same dramatic shift in the character of our image. Interesting. When we hit save here, nothing happens. This is because in the case of any raw format, such as Red R3D, Airy Raw, or Blackmagic's B-Raw, your color management framework is going to automatically input map those images appropriately. So you will not see a change in the mapping of these images regardless of how you set up your input device transform. This is only the case with raw formats. With any other format of image or clip that you bring into your project, you want to make sure that it is being mapped appropriately from its initial state. Which leads me to another question. Let's go back to shot number 1 here and once again go to our project settings and restore our sound color management, where we are starting with Alexa and mapping out to Rec 709, so that when I hit save here, I'm looking at a nice healthy level of saturation and contrast on my image that I can grade underneath. But let's now observe another question, which is this. If I go to shot number 2 here, you're going to see that my image changes slightly. It's being mapped in a different way. But isn't the point of color management to give me a common foundation rather than images which are mapped differently? Let's now take a look at shot number 2 and observe that there's actually a discrepancy between these images and the way their contrast is being mapped out to Rec 709. The reason for this is that this first image is in an Airy Alexa log C color space, which means that we have appropriately input mapped it. But this shot, shot number 2, is in a different color space. This is actually in Sony's S-Log3 S-Gamut3 Cine color space. I actually need to designate, just for this shot, a different input color space in order to get a valid result. So I can do this within ACES by right-clicking on the thumbnail for a shot and just on the basis of this shot saying, hey, I want to change my ACES input transform. It's fine for all of my other shots to take the default value of an Alexa color space, but in this case, I want to designate a different input color space. And because I know that this is Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut3.Cine, I'm going to make that selection here. And you'll now see that if I flip between shots 1 and 2, I have an identical reproduction. And this is a perfect example of the power of good sound color management, which allows you to map material from different cameras into a common starting point so that you can focus on the creative rather than the technical aspects of your grade. Now that we have discussed the ACES color management workflow, let's move on and talk about another color management workflow available to us here in Resolve Color Management V2, which we can access in the same section of our project settings where we were a moment ago. So if I go to my File menu and my project settings, and I go to my color management section here, I now want to return to my color science drop-down menu, and I'm this time going to select not DaVinci YRGB and not one of my ACES flavors, but DaVinci YRGB Color Managed. And when I do, we're going to see that our menu items underneath change once again. Now, by default, we have this Resolve Color Management preset option, which gives us a very convenient way to quickly get our color management set up. I'm going to go to DaVinci Wide Gamut. And you'll notice that when I am using this preset, I actually don't have a drop-down menu for setting up my input color space. I'm going to need to do that at the individual shot level when I'm working with these presets. However, I do still need to set up my output color space, which is currently set to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, and that's a good default when we are mastering for standard Rec 709 SDR material. With these settings selected, let's once again save and observe how our image is going to change. Whoops, what happened? We're back to a flat, log, low contrast, low saturation image. What's going on? What's going on is we have yet to set up the input color space of the shots here in our timeline, because remember, we're not setting those up at the project level when using our presets inside of Resolve Color Management. What we need to do next is right-click on our image and go to Input Color Space. You'll notice that the language has changed ever so slightly from our ACES workflow, where we were designating an ACES input transform. We're now designating an input color space. Same thing, different name. With our input color space, we now need to scroll down and select sgamut3.cine/slog3. And once we do, you're going to see that I once again have a nice normalized image with healthy contrast and color. And same thing here on shot number 1. I would want to right click on this shot and select an input color space of Log C, which I already have here. These images have now been successfully normalized and mapped inside of my Resolve Color Management workflow. And once again, I just want to point out that all of my raw material taking place here later in the timeline is automatically being mapped for me. And in fact, I don't even have the option of changing my input color space because Resolve has me covered. It is automatically correctly mapping that raw image into my color management workflow. Thus far, we've talked about a couple of different solutions for color management inside of Resolve. I now want to go a little bit deeper into Resolve Color Management and talk about some of the extra tools and parameters that are available to us if we wish to exert control over them. So let's go back to our project settings under our File menu and return to our Color Management. And I want to pay closer attention now to my Resolve Color Management preset. You'll notice that we have a couple of good, sensible presets which exist to help us get our color management going quickly when we're working in Resolve. However, there may be instances where we wish to exert more granular control over the way that we are shepherding our image from its original camera negative state out to our display. And with Resolve Color Management, we have an extensive set of options available to us for controlling that journey. If I go down here to my custom preset option, you're going to see that I have a number of different parameters exposed to me. And it's okay if you don't understand what all of these are all at once, because there's quite a few here. And the best thing that you can do in terms of getting more comfortable with what these do is to simply experiment and spend some time with them. But I want to walk you through what each of them does in broad strokes here today. We have an input color space, which, as we discussed a moment ago, when we are in a default preset here, we don't have the option of declaring at the project level at all, but we now can. So let's say that we had a timeline full of Log C material and we didn't want to do what we were doing a moment ago of right-clicking on each thumbnail and saying, hey, this is Arri Log C. We would want to choose the custom preset so that we can explicitly designate an input color space for all of our shots without having to manually tag each one of them. So in my case, I'm going to select Arri Log C for this. Next, we have a timeline color space. Timeline color space is a more advanced consideration within color management, so I would encourage you to leave this at its default of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate unless you're more experienced and you have specific reason to select another color space. Timeline working luminance is also another more advanced aspect of color management, which is essentially allowing us to control the peak luminance of our image as it moves from its high dynamic range acquisition state and into its lower dynamic range reproduction state. Again, I would encourage you to leave this at its default value of HDR 4000 unless you're more experienced and you are seeking to get a different visual result. Next, we have our output color space, which we've already set up. Rec. 709 Gamma 2.4 is the standard selection we would want to make here when we are mastering for SDR Rec. 709. Next, we have our limit output gamut. Again, a more advanced option that you can safely leave at its default unless you have specific reason to change it. And then we have our input and our output DRT. Again, more advanced options, very powerful options available to us when we want to customize the tone mapping aspect of our color management, but something best left at its default until you reach a point where you are trying to get a different behavior than you are seeing with your default settings. So these are some of the additional options which are available to us inside of Resolve Color Management. This is a more extensive set of options than we have available to us inside of ACES, and this can be a good or a bad thing depending on your experience level and on your project's needs. If you wish to exert more control over your image and you really need to sculpt every aspect and contour of the color management pipeline, you might wish to go with Resolve Color Management. Conversely, if you wish to get something on its feet more quickly, you might choose to go with one of the presets here in the preset drop-down menu, or to use ACES, where the number of parameters that you need to control and set are more limited in their scope. So this is an overall introduction to some of the more advanced options available to you within Resolve Color Management. But I want to emphasize that what's important when you are beginning to use color management or beginning to use color management inside of Resolve is to pick out some sensible defaults and just get comfortable with the system and understand the overall concepts that are driving the color management, as opposed to feeling the need to exert explicit control over every single one of these values. And now that we've talked about Resolve Color Management as well as ACES, it's time to discuss what the real practical difference is between the two, because I hear the question a lot, which one should I use? Which one is better? And it may not surprise you to learn that there's no simple answer to that question, but we can make a meaningful comparison of the two. And the best way to begin that comparison is to make a visual comparison of what ACES will do for us versus what Resolve Color Management will do for us. I'm going to return my color management preset to my DaVinci Wide Gamut preset for now, because I don't need to have all of those extra options available to me at the moment. Once I do this, I'm going to hit save, and I want to go back to my timeline here and just take a look at my images. I'm going to grab a still of image number 1 and a few other of the images here in this timeline, because I want to make a comparison to what I'm seeing here inside of Resolve Color Management versus what I will see in an equivalent setup inside of ACES. So now that I've grabbed these stills, I'm going to go back to shot number 1. Once again, go to my project settings, and I'm going to switch my color science back to ACES CCT and ensure that my input and output transform values have remained where I want them to go. And when I hit save here, I want to now go to the still that I saved up here and compare one to the other. I want you to notice that even though I have equivalent pipelines set up here that are accurately mapping me from what the camera saw into what my display can reproduce, I'm actually getting different visual results. This isn't a design flaw or a problem or a question of which is more accurate or less accurate. This is due to the nature of mapping high dynamic range, large color volume imagery like we might get off of a professional or a prosumer camera down into the lower dynamic range and lower color volume of an SDR or even HDR display. There's always going to be some subjective considerations involved in that engineering. So when we look at the difference between our ACES display prepped image and our Resolve Color Management display prepped image, that is the difference that we are looking at. We're looking at two equally valid but distinct solutions to this challenge of how do we map all of this dynamic range and all of this color volume down into the more limited dynamic range and color volume which our display is capable of reproducing. That's consideration number one when we are talking about which color management framework we should choose, is simply observing that there are aesthetic differences between the two and being mindful of that when we select the color management framework that we use for a particular project. Other than choosing between ACES and Resolve Color Management based on your visual preference, there's a couple other considerations that you can make. The first is that ACES has been around for a longer time than Resolve Color Management, so it enjoys broader industry support than Resolve Color Management does. So if you are working with multiple vendors in tight collaboration, you might find that an ACES workflow supports that better. Resolve Color Management, as we've already explored, has some more granular control available to us that we don't have in ACES. So if that's important to you, that might be a good reason to select Resolve Color Management. I want to re-emphasize that both of these color management solutions can give you great results, and the right choice for your project is whichever one works. Let's now talk about one of the most powerful tools within DaVinci Resolve when we are working in a color managed environment, and that is the High Dynamic Range palette down here in the lower left corner of my Resolve interface. The High Dynamic Range palette is unique in Resolve in that it is one of the few tools within Resolve that's what we call color space aware, meaning that it is hooked into our color management settings as we established in our project settings, and it is altering its behavior on the basis of those settings. And this is going to allow us to get more naturalistic and more photographically accurate adjustments. For example, on an image like this one, I might wish to cool things off a little bit, feel like they're a little too warm where they are right now. One way that I could go about this here in the HDR palette would be to go to my temperature knob and swing this knob in a negative direction, and in doing so, cool things off. So this is a really nice, objective, and photographically accurate way of making such an adjustment. And it's going to give me very similar results to what I would have gotten if I were to go back in time and change the color temperature in the camera at the moment that this image was captured. So you can see as I flip this off and on, how naturalistic that adjustment is. And let's go a little bit further even so that it's quite easy for us to see. So there's a good example of an adjustment that really benefits from being photographically accurate and allows me to be more objective and precise in my adjustment instead of feeling my way through things with traditional color correction tools. And the same concept extends to exposure as well. So if I were to go to a shot like this one and say, you know, really what needs to happen here more than the adjustment of my primaries or my contrast is that I need to adjust my exposure. Here within the HDR palette, because I am color space aware, I can make a photographically accurate exposure adjustment by grabbing this global exposure slider here and moving it in a negative direction. So again, very organic, naturalistic, photographically accurate adjustment that I can make here within the HDR palette. These are just a few of the adjustments that are available to us within this tool set that really benefit from a sound color management framework being set up around them. You can still use the HDR palette if you are not color managed, but it really comes to life and becomes more powerful when you are working in a color managed framework such as ACES or Resolve Color Management. Another one of the key benefits of a color managed workflow is that it allows us to target different displays and display color spaces with the flip of a switch. So thus far, we've been working in an SDR display space. So all of our grading and all of our mastering is being done for a Rec. 709 monitor. But we may also wish to do a master for, say, a P3 D65 1000 nit, which is a common spec for HDR delivery. And let's say that I've already gone through and graded my entire timeline in an SDR space, and I now want to target that different display color space, that HDR display color space. Maybe I've done the SDR grade and my client has come back and said, hey, we would like to do an HDR version now. With color management, we can flip a switch and do what's called a trim pass, meaning make small adjustments, but we don't need to redo our entire grade, and the bulk of our creative intent will be preserved. Let's take a look at how that would go. I'm going to go to my File menu and to my project settings. And here inside of my ACES color management, I'm going to change my output device transform because I no longer want to target a Rec. 709 display, but an HDR display, specifically a P3 D65 1000 nit display color space. So I'm going to scroll through my options and find that designation, which is right here. P3 D65 ST2084 1000 nit. So once I make this selection and I hit save, we're going to see a change in our image. And to our eye, because right now we are viewing these images in an SDR Rec. 709 display space, the image no longer looks correct. It's no longer properly prepared for our display. But if I were viewing this image on an HDR reference monitor, I would now be looking at the correct preparation for that monitor. And all I would need to do from here in terms of delivering my graded master for that new secondary display color space would be a trim pass in which I go through each of my shots and ensure that my creative intent has been well preserved in that translation from my original display color space to the new display color space that I'm targeting. Let's now discuss how Dolby Vision configures into a good color management workflow inside of Resolve. So we've just done a workflow where we were starting with an SDR graded master and then mapping that up into an HDR display color space. Dolby Vision allows us to do the opposite. So let's say we have graded an HDR deliverable on an HDR display and we've delivered it for HDR, but we now need to generate the SDR version of that image. As we've just learned, one option for that would be to go into our color management settings. So if I went into my project settings right now, I could change my output device transform from this HDR specification that it's currently set to, and I could flip back to Rec. 709, and this would allow me to preserve my grade and its creative intent in an SDR rendering of this grade, which was originally performed in HDR. But I'm actually not going to do this. We're going to do it in a different way now using Dolby Vision. So I'm going to leave this setting where it was. I'm going to scroll back up and say P3 D65 ST2084 1000 nit. And we now want to go down to Dolby Vision here and say Enable Dolby Vision. And all Dolby Vision is a system for preserving our creative intent between an HDR master and a derived SDR master. When I hit save here, you're not going to see anything happen. I'm still going to be looking at an HDR image that doesn't look quite right on our displays because we're all viewing this on a Rec. 709 display. But when I hit save, I'm going to get a little Dolby Vision palette available to me down here in the lower left. And if I tap on this palette, you'll see that I have a drop-down menu for my target display output. And this is where I am going to tell the Dolby Vision system what derived master I would like to be targeting based on my original HDR master. Right now, I'm at the default value of 100 nit BT709, BT1886 full. And all this means is Rec. 709, SDR. And I'm going to check this Enable Tone Mapping Preview option. And all I'm going to do from here is say Analyze Frame, like so. And you'll see that all of a sudden my image comes to life and it looks correct for my Rec. 709 SDR display. This is because under the hood, the Dolby Vision system is making a dynamic analysis of this HDR image that I'm feeding to it, and it is applying a best fit mapping from that HDR space down into the space that I've designated here. In this case, 100 nit, BT709, BT1886 full. So that's how Dolby Vision configures into the color management framework inside of DaVinci Resolve. And interestingly, when we are using Dolby Vision, we end up not generating a second deliverable at all, but instead we have what's called a derived master, meaning that the mapping from HDR to SDR travels as a piece of metadata with the HDR master, and it happens on the fly within the device which is playing back the content. And furthermore, if I have a Dolby Vision license, I can go into my primary trims here and control on a shot-by-shot basis the exact way that that image is being mapped from HDR down to SDR. However, this is not necessary to use the Dolby Vision system, and it simply provides an alternate way of getting an SDR master from an HDR grade, and in the case of Dolby Vision, without needing to generate a second physical file. Thanks for joining me for this overview of color management in DaVinci Resolve 17. If you have further questions or you need tech support, you can check out the Blackmagic forum. And for more resources on training, be sure to check out the training section of the Blackmagic website.